Today we're talking about revealing the secret to the promise. So today's talk was actually inspired by the idea of a knock-knock joke, and you don't really have to play along here, but the joke goes knock knock, right? And then everyone says, "Who's there?" God. God, who, right? God, how do I know it's you? That's the question. How do I know it's you? How do I know whether this idea of that I have is a divine idea or just a pie in the sky idea? How do I know that what it is I'm desiring to do is what I really want to do and it's a divine idea? How do I know that the decision that I'm about to make is the right decision? How do I know that the direction I'm about to go off is in the right direction? How do I know? How do I know? How do I know? In the Science of Mind textbook, Ernest Holmes tells us over and over again that there is something within us that always knows, right? The Bible tells us that the Father knoweth what things you have need of even before you ask. That even before the prayer is prayed, the solution is provided. That before the question is asked, it is answered. And those are wonderful and comforting words, aren't they? But how do we know that the answer we think we are hearing is the right answer? How can we know that the solution that seems to appear at the right time is the right solution? And so we search for a way to know. And one way we may do this is to ask for a sign. And that can be kind of fun, you know. Okay, I need a sign. I know Edwin Gaines had that great story. You know, okay, God, you know, my conference got canceled. I've got payroll to make. How am I going to, you know, and casino, win big. She pulled in and she did, you know. So, yeah, sometimes we can ask for a sign. And illustrated in a book whose title actually inspired my talk today, which is, the book is called How Do We Know It's God? And it's by Dan Wakefield. And this is the story that he tells. He said, a woman's been going out with the same man for several years, but she just isn't sure whether she should marry him or not. And she prays and she asks for a sign from God. And one day she's sitting on the floor in her living room and she's trying to pray about it and she's trying to meditate. And she thinks she sees a sign. The way that the sunlight is coming in and falls on the carpet seems to form a letter from the alphabet. And it's the first letter of the man's name. Is this a sign? Is this the guidance she's been praying for? Is this God's way of telling her to marry this man? Or is it simply the sun shining on the carpet? I'm thinking, in my mind, if she's having doubts, that's more of a sign. Or the other way that we seek to know is through logic. A man wonders if he ought to take a job that would pay more money, but it would require him to move to another city, and he'd have to leave his friends and his neighbors. And he makes a list of the pros and cons of the move. Have you ever done that? Gotten a list out, pros and cons, right? And he's totaling up each column, and he's trying to figure out if the greater number of reasons on one side means that it's the right thing to do, it's the best course of action, or he wonders, should each reason be weighted? Because, you know, maybe family has a little more weight than, you know, money over here, I don't know. And given a number value according to the importance. And then even if he did that, it all adds up to the answer. Would it be the answer, the course that he should follow? Or we seek the advice from friends, therapists, practitioners, ministers, anyone who will listen. There's a great scene. Did anybody ever used to watch Frasier? With the little dog, right? Well, there's a scene in Frasier where Niles, his brother's asking for love advice from a magazine telemarketer. Now, I thought, actually, this is actually pretty brilliant because they'd probably stop calling if we started asking them for advice, wouldn't they? But do you see yourself in any of these scenarios, you know, where I'm not sure what to do? Well, let me talk to this person. Let me talk to this person. Let me make pros and cons. I'm looking for a sign. What am I supposed to do? We all wrestle with the question, what's the right thing to do? And despite the assurances that we're given by Holmes and in the Bible and from many other sacred writings, we still search, we still pray, we meditate, we look for signs, we apply logical tests, and we seek the advice of friends and therapists and practitioners and ministers and anyone who will listen, and sometimes even telemarketers. Although now that their number shows up on my TV, I don't even answer that. It's kind of fun. So, and still, after all that, we still don't know. How can we be sure? If only God would speak to us, boom out instructions from a voice on high, would we all gladly follow? Okay, we're getting the message, right? If only we knew. Do you ever wonder about that burning bush with Moses? Of course we have the Hollywood version, right? This voice of God and Charlton Heston. There had to be a dramatic Hollywood element to the instructions given to Moses, or people would doubt, don't you think, that it was God speaking? Somehow Moses saying that he got quiet and a small, still voice within him told him that these were the 10 Commandments that everyone... Do you think that they would follow that? Or is it a little more, engaging to say, there was a bush and it was on fire and it started speaking and the voice of God boomed down and told me? That is a little more engaging, isn't it? A little more captivating. Quite the interesting thought of what gets our attention and how we follow that. But sometimes, even the booming voice of God isn't enough. Like the hiker who was hiking down the steep and narrow trails and the switchbacks of the Grand Canyon, and he lost his footing and he fell off the side. And tumbling through the air, he reached up and he grabbed a tiny little bush sticking out on the side, and as he hung on for dear life, he looked down and he saw that it was at least 500 feet to the bottom, and the bottom was full of sharp rocks, big boulders, right? And then he looked up and hollered, "Is anyone up there that can help me?" And a great voice boomed from heaven and said, "Yes, son, I can." Stunned to hear the voice, the hiker said, "God, is that you?" "Yes, my son, it is I, the great I am," replied the voice. Relieved beyond belief to be hearing directly from God, the hiker asked, "What do you want me to do? Just tell me what to do and I'll do it." The great voice replied, "Just let go." And the hiker looked down again at the 500-foot drop and the rocks below. He looked up again and he asked, "Is anyone else up there that I can talk to?" What we are looking for is a kind of guidance and a wisdom from God or Spirit that theology calls discernment. I love words. Discernment. This is such a great word. And if you saw yourself in any of the examples that I gave, you might take comfort in knowing that people throughout the ages have searched for discernment. Religious leaders and even saints have spent most of their lives trying to learn not only how to do it themselves, but how to teach others how to try. In his book, How Do We Know When It's God?, Dan Wakefield relates the story of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Any Catholics here know of that saint? I know Loyola, the school in Southern California.
She knows all the saints.
I know, Patricia knows them all. Well, he sounds like a pretty interesting guy. He lived in the early 1500s, and he founded the Order of the Jesuits. He's considered by many to be the greatest authority of discernment in the Christian tradition. So he's a pretty important guy. He even wrote a book on it. It's called Rules of Discernment of Spirits, and yet had difficulties discerning himself. It's told that although he was able to discern from daydreams that God was leading him to a new way of life and the Madonna came to him in a vision, he still couldn't decide whether or not to kill a Moor who didn't believe in the virgin birth of Jesus. He could not discern if it was the right thing for him to do to defend the honor of the Madonna. In an argument about the subject, the Moor saw how upset Ignatius was getting and wisely hurried ahead, while Ignatius became more and more disturbed and more concerned that he failed his religious duty. Remember, this was the 1500s. Part of him really wanted to pursue this Moor and stab him with his dagger, but he couldn't quite make up his mind to do it. He couldn't discern what to do, in other words, and luckily for the Moor, Ignatius let the mule that he was riding make the decision, and the mule didn't follow the Moor down the road that the Moor took. He took a different route. I'm not sure with that big of a decision I would leave it up to my mule, but he did.
Have animal instincts.
Yeah, could be. Dan Wakefield wrote, If it's that hard for St. Ignatius to discern whether to stab a Moor in his theological argument, perhaps those of us looking for signs in patterns of sunlight, lists of pros and cons, and asking anyone who will listen are not so hopeless after all. And so, this is the topic for us to talk about this morning, the topic of spiritual discernment. How to know if we know. How to know. And I'm not saying that I have surpassed any scholars or religious leaders of the ages and have it all figured out, because I certainly do not. But I am very inspired by this subject. I'm very inspired because there are times when I feel so totally in the flow and everything just seems to be clicking and coming together, and I am so sure. And then there are other times when I'm not sure of anything at all. It's just like, wow, well, maybe is that, and all these little doubts come flying in. When I asked myself where we should start on this journey of knowing how to know, the answer that came to me while meditating, this came into my head, and I discerned that it was the right answer, I think, is that first and foremost, we have to have a willingness to listen. This has been one of my great lessons in life, because my father always said that, we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth. For a reason. As a kid, I was quite the chatterbox. So this has been quite a lesson for me, a willingness to listen. Before we can attain spiritual discernment, before we can possibly expect to be guided and directed to those right decisions, before we can hope to have a knowing that our choices are for the highest and best good of all concerned, before we can feel that our actions and activities support a life that is satisfying and joyous, we must first be willing to listen. In The Science of Mind, Ernest Holmes wrote, "The spirit within us is God, and only to the degree that we listen to and seek to obey this spirit shall we really succeed. But first, we must be willing to listen." And frankly, many of us, myself included, aren't always willing. I know I'm not. A woman worked at a large bookstore and was often amused by the combinations of books that the customers chose. She found it particularly funny when a customer approached the checkout counter with 2 bestsellers that day. The first was titled Conversations with God. I'm sure you've all heard of that one. And the second, How to Argue and Win Every Time. What keeps us from listening, really listening, and then acting upon that which we hear? Most of the time, this is my opinion, I think it's fear. We'll hear something and we'll go, oh, no. No. And we hear that God is telling us to do something or inspiring or an idea that comes to us that is so out of the range of our comfort zone that it scares the bejesus out of us. There are times when that happens, Wow, I can just think back on a few things where we were divinely inspired. I can just remember when we came up here on a trip from Southern California. We were living down there and didn't even have kids at the time, and came on a vacation and said, we love it up here. We love the people up here. We love the weather up here. We love how it smells up here. We lived in Smogland, right? And it was like, oh, but we couldn't possibly move up here. We couldn't possibly do that. There's just no possible way. Well, guess what? There was a possible way, but we didn't know it at the time. So we had this inspiration, but didn't listen until later on when things all fell together. Holmes writes in The Science of Mind, fear blocks the more complete givingness of the spirit to humankind. Fear arises from that mental attitude which limits the possibility and the willingness of spirit to give us the good that we so greatly desire. And as I look at my fears this morning, I invite you to look at yours as well. What are you afraid to listen to? What are you not willing to hear? And if you are willing, how can you move past that fear? How can you move forward toward willingness? And even baby steps are okay. That's the beauty of this. Nobody's asking you to do anything, one way and then the next day the next. Any progress that we make towards our dream is okay. Baby steps are great. We've actually taken that philosophy with growing our church. We've been very deliberate, very conscious that we want to be mindful about how we grow our center, how we invite people and encourage growth here. And it's been wonderful. It has been absolutely lovely. So take the advice from Eric Butterworth. We know he was a Unity minister and an author who offered a technique for times when guidance is needed. He says to close your eyes and be still and say softly with assurance, Father, I am listening. Or if you're not comfortable with Father, God, I am listening. Spirit, I am listening. It's such a powerful thing to say. Spirit, I am listening. About this technique, he wrote, you will find marvelous guidance manifested in you. You will feel a sense of conviction, a sense of assurance, a sense of spontaneity, which can be frightening to some as well, but it's a good feeling. And you will be led. Jesus said, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come to him and I will sup with him and he will be with me. As we have a willingness to listen, we come to realize that our answers, our guidance, and our inspiration may come directly, or it may come indirectly, perhaps in a conversation, or through an inspiration of a great piece of music. Sometimes you're inspired just by, you hear a song and you go, oh my gosh, the memories take you back, right? Or in something that we read, or something that we see, or a person that we run into. We just don't know where it's going to come from. And it may even come in a dream. I know a lot of people who record their dreams. But it will come when we have a willingness to listen. I think we get stuck thinking that we have to figure it all out ourselves. I know that I'm at point A and I want to be at point B, and I have to figure out how I'm going to get there, and that is not the truth. We can say, Spirit, I am willing to listen and I am listening. And then we can just let it go and know that it's unfolding. And it does. Edward Hersey Richards wrote, a wise old owl sat on an oak. The more he saw, the less he spoke. The less he spoke, the more he heard. Why aren't we like that wise old bird? I like birds. I like birds. Here's an are you willing to listen test. We are willing to listen when our focus is on the truth, forgiveness, and desire to remove the blocks and resistance to the expansion of consciousness. We are willing to listen when we commit to spending time within, and yes, it's that big old word that starts with an M, meditation. Take a little time just to meditate, to be quiet, to be still. We are not so willing to listen when we are absorbed by our problems, when we focus on our troubles, and when we work on building our defenses, and when we are always looking out there. If we're always coming up with the next reason why we can't move on, then we're not in a place where we're listening and able to get out of our situation. Those willing to listen are seeking to hear Spirit. Those who are not are only looking for solutions. Solutions may or may not only be temporary. Listen to the closing words from Ernest Holmes as he discusses an individual who had this willingness to listen, perhaps more down pat than anyone. This is from The Science of Mind on page 366, and it says, Jesus spent much of his time communing with his own soul. For it is through our inner thought that we contact God. To this remarkable man, out of the silence of his own soul came a direct revelation of his oneness with God. Back of the conflict of ideas, back of the din of external life and action, back in the innermost recesses of uplifted thought and silent contemplation, there is a voice ever proclaiming, "This is my beloved." Seldom does the voice penetrate the outer world of human experience. Seldom do we allow it to perfectly express through us. We must learn to listen to this voice. Call it conscience, intuition, or what we will, it is there. No one need go unguided through life, for we are divine at the center and all our images of the Most High. You can read that in your own Science of Mind, because that's a lovely passage. First and foremost, in knowing how to know, first and foremost in mastering this idea of spiritual discernment is being willing to listen. If you are, you will no longer ask, "How do I know it's you, God?" For you will know without a doubt. And so it is.
Got time for one more aha?